very few people were trying to bring together these two big sets of issues, two big debates. The one about political change, democratization, democracy support, and the other climate change and how to respond to climate change. And there's a gap there that perhaps it is worth trying to see if there are connections in very complex ways that are sometimes direct but often indirect, and sometimes the effects are not immediate and obvious but maybe play out over a longer period of time. One thought, and perhaps it is a worrying thought, is that the harmful effects of climate change will make it more difficult for new democracies to persist in stabilising their new democracy, and make it more difficult for non-democracies even to get onto the path of becoming democratic. And this may be especially true in those parts of the world that have what are called fragile states, weak states, not necessarily failing or collapsed, but nevertheless states that are still somewhat shaky. Turning it around, as we heard in the discussion today, there is at least a conventional assumption that maybe with respect to matters to do with the environment, democracies will do it better. In some sense, they are better equipped to rise to environmental challenges. And if that is the case, this prompts the question, if humankind is to make an appropriate response to climate change, would a world in which there were more stable democracies be more likely to reach a solution?
Is it the case that democracies are doing better?
I don't think it is as simple as that, for various reasons. One is I believe that getting to be like a stable democracy is a rocky road. Many countries are trying that, but finding that obstacles along the way, there are setbacks, it can throw up instability. Secondly, that democracy is not a sufficient response to this particularly thorny issue. I think issues of governance and executive capacity also come in. One can have a stable democracy but not really be able to achieve very much. And it is possible to have effective governance even in the absence of a strong democratic system. So I think there are other political variables in the mix before we can put together a profile, if you like, of the right political criteria that will produce solutions to these problems that are themselves very different. The mitigation problem, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is not the same problem as the adaptation problem, protecting citizens who are vulnerable to, exposed to the harmful effects of climate change. And we cannot assume necessarily that exactly the same set of political institutions will be best equipped to tackle both of those huge, complex challenges.
My question is, do they have to be tackled at the same time? Can countries, for example, the poorer countries, start already with mitigation efforts as best as they can, like reforestation?
I think that's a very good question indeed, and it raises the other questions like, well, how long have we got? Some of the scientists tell us some very scary stories about tipping points and turning points, that things have to be done before it is too late. And given that we believe that it will not be very long before the developing world as a whole is making the lion's share of the contribution to new greenhouse gas emissions, that would seem to suggest that developing countries, as well as the developed countries, must start fairly soon to reduce at least the rate of increase in their CO2 or general greenhouse gas emissions, and cannot be, as it were, excused indefinitely. For some of them, the adaptation issue is here and now already, as we heard in the conversation this morning. People on the ground, poor people, vulnerable people, and it's often women in particular, are suffering the consequences of a changing climate and of severe weather events. There is no time to be lost in trying to facilitate, assist, support people in the affected communities to cope with what is happening before their very eyes.
Most of the countries are asking for monetary contributions in order to be able to do something. Do you think that these mitigation efforts cannot be done without the financial support of the industrialized nations?
I think we're getting here into the deep waters of international politics, and I think that the richer world has to be seen to be shouldering maybe a disproportionate share of the burden in order to get everybody on side. After all, as we know, the richer countries are responsible for where we are now in terms of the historically accumulated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and so it is only right that they recognise that they have a special responsibility in that respect, and that they are specially endowed in terms of their wealth to help others who are less well endowed make their contribution to the problem. I think it is gradually, that message has gradually been getting through, but it has, I think at Copenhagen there were moves made in the right direction in terms of international commitments to create funding to enable adaptation as well as mitigation efforts to grow in parts of the developing world. But I don't think we're there yet. I think promises are made, but as we know, there is often then a little bit of a slip before those promises are implemented or deliverable. And I think, as one could have anticipated in advance, when the stakes are up, when dollars are mentioned, money is on the table, then you get into another level of debate about, well, will that money be spent effectively and efficiently? Haven't we been there before? Starting to get cold feet, and it takes a while to put on the ground the mechanisms for making sure that the expense does actually meet the objectives that it is supposed to meet, and to build trust that that will happen. And I think we're still in that stage of the game, as it were. Before this morning's meeting, I commented to one of the other speakers that perhaps at Copenhagen we had expectations that were a little bit too high, and no wonder we were disappointed with the outcome. Maybe at Cancun we now have rather modest expectations in the light of Copenhagen, and maybe we will be pleasantly surprised as a result of what is finally decided there. I actually doubt that that will be the case. I think maybe we need another couple, 3 more years. One reason for saying that is, of course, that in China there is, we know, going to be a leadership change, and maybe leaders matter. We do know that President Obama is struggling a little bit at the moment in terms of domestic politics. If he has the good fortune to be re-elected for a second term, then it is normal for US presidents in the second term to be able to do things that perhaps they couldn't risk doing during their first term in office. And so maybe just a few years down the line there will be a bit more political freedom for key players in the game to rise to the challenge. I'm not entirely confident it will happen, but it may be that there will be more space and opportunity, and especially if, as a result of Cancun and lack of progress, we see the clock ticking still further, and especially if the scientists, as they have a tendency to do, keep coming along with ever more alarming predictions. And I think as our knowledge increases, as we close down on the errors, if you will, in climate science, dispel some of the doubts, counter some of the skeptics, one would like to think that human beings, being quite rational, will increasingly see the urgency of taking action, and that if we can't have yet another Copenhagen or yet another Cancun, that whatever city is privileged to hold the next one, I'm not sure which one it is, there will be even more sense of urgency, as well as maybe more political opportunity to do the business. Right now, no, but remember, we're coming off the back of an economic and financial crisis, if you will. I know Germany is coming out in very good shape, but that is not true of some other countries. A country very close to my own, Ireland, is in terrible situation right now. And we know that may not be the end of the story. And so the minds of politicians are distracted, shall we say. They have other, they are firefighting, they have other things to try and attend to. And so it is understandable why perhaps responding to climate change has slipped on the political agenda. We can only hope that once the current financial and economic problems have been managed out of the way, shall we say, that then we can revisit the agenda and place climate change a bit higher up. Again, I'm not saying that that is likely. I do think there are 1 or 2 other issues that are looming that will come along and take the eye. For example, if, let us say, for example, if it is found that Iran does have nuclear weapons capability, that again is going to, I think, considerably tax the ability of our political leaders, and again may mean that they take their eye off the climate change ball for a while. But as I say, the clock is ticking.